Namaste and welcome to the Bharatvaarta podcast. It is our privilege and honor to host Vikram Sampath on the podcast today. Vikram is an esteemed historian and author of 5 acclaimed books: Splendours of Royal Mysore, a biography of Gauhar Jaan, Balachander, and of course, a 2-volume biography of Swatantraveer Savarkar. In 2021, he was elected as a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society. He's a former senior fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library and has many more achievements under his belt. Welcome to the podcast, Vikram. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you, Roshan. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you on Bharatvaarta. And of course, joining me in co-hosting this episode is Amit Paranjpe, who you've heard on multiple Bharatvaarta podcasts earlier, speaking on things like science and technology and history. So over to you, Amit. You can begin the podcast and I can join you afterwards.
Thanks, Roshan, and it's great to see you, Vikram. I know we were trying to get this set up for a while, so really appreciate your time. I know how busy you are, as Roshan said. So let's get right to it. I know you have had some very interesting past few weeks, past few months, ever since this volume, this amazing piece of work, scholarship, whatever you want to call it. I mean, just look at. I don't know how many pages it finally ran into. I'm not fully done through it. I'm probably more than halfway through it right now. But you put in such an amazing effort for both the volumes. And more than the first volume, the second volume seems to have gotten some interesting, I'll just say interesting and leave it at that, critical acclaim from some sides. And to be honest, and I've been reading some of it, seeing some of your tweets about it as well, I'm sure it's been very tough for you as well. This cancel culture of, who's a historian and who gets to decide who's a historian and what is scholarship like. And, do I need to be in a university for 30 years to be branded as a historian? So this discussion has gone on. And frankly, I'm sure it must have been a big distraction for you. And I hope we move on from that. But I would like to get brief comments from you on this cancel culture in academia right now, or in research scholarship. And views on history. I mean, people have different views on history and rewriting history. And there are both sides. There are multiple sides to it often. So would like to get your perspective on this whole issue before we directly jump into the book.
Right. Thank you, Amit. And thank you, Roshan. It's always a pleasure to talk to Amit offline and online. I think this cancel culture that you mentioned, Amit, I think it goes beyond academia. It goes into the realm of we dehyphenate it wrongly, calling it left liberal. I don't think there's anything liberal about the left worldwide, but still it's a euphemism that is used time and again. I faced it multiple number of times now, almost 8 years ago, if you remember, and some of your viewers may remember, just because I had a contrarian opinion on the award Vapsi campaign and all of that, and also my views on Tipu Sultan and the Tipu Jayanti that was being celebrated in my hometown Bangalore, for which I had to pay a very heavy price in terms of having to resign from the festival that I founded, the literature festival in Bangalore, the Bangalore Lit Fest, where the general tendency is to group together. Pack of hyenas always go in groups, so they never go alone. So and then it's bullying and then intimidation, and then you kind of precipitate a situation to such an extent that the other person is so intimidated that they either run away from the battle, or they are forced to accept your point of view. So this is a very classic tendency of bullying which goes on, and I've faced that in the past. And so I think somewhere down the line, after 7-8 years, become a little more thick-skinned about it. And particularly, I think I knew that when a book like this on a person as polarizing and contentious as Veer Savarkar, if I'm taking up the challenge of writing it, something about him, if it goes against the established norms or the preconceived ideas that a particular group has and wishes to perpetuate, then obviously they would be attacked at multiple levels. There would be personal slander done against me. So this was in series that these attacks came, and I was looking at it very gleefully, expecting how it actually unfolds itself. So the first set is personal attacks, where you impute motives, you impute, associations and all of that. I mean, I have zero affiliation with any formal capacity with any political party or with any ideological group. There is an idea, there is an Indic thought which I subscribe to, and I'm very proud of that. But that doesn't necessarily translate to a person being a part of either the ruling dispensation or the organizations that are behind it and so on. So this distinction is not made, and these personal attacks that you're actually doing all this at the behest and call of somebody, or worse, with regular paychecks and all kinds of allegations like that, which are completely unsubstantiated and stupid lies. So this was the first part of the campaign, which started, I think, late last year, went on for quite some time, and then, as you rightly said, start doubting the credentials of the person. Who is a historian? He's not even a historian. Now, who determines who is a historian? And what is a professional historian versus a non-professional? Today, I'm a full-time, my profession is writing books on history. Though offers did come for me to join academics, I chose not to, only because I would like to remain independent and would like to dedicate my time in the study and research of history, which I do 24/7. So if that is not being a professional historian, I really don't know what else is. And then, nitpicking of going into the details of my past academic career. Of course, in my earlier avatar, I was an engineer. I did my mathematics, I did my MBA, I was in the corporate sector, but history was always something that interested me since childhood. And from the age of 13 and 14 is when I started working on my first book on Mysore. And even as I worked in the corporate sector, my first book came out when I was 25 or 26 years old. And the 3 books, on Gauhar Jaan, on Balachander, etc., also came out while I was working in the corporate sector. And then actually, I branched out. I had course correction in careers. Everyone does this very routinely, where a university of the reputation of the University of Queensland in Australia actually invited me to do a PhD. I mean, not to sound vain here, but then a series of scholarships which very few people in the humanities actually received. The Australian government actually gave me those scholarships to pursue my PhD. I went through the rigors of it for 4 long years with supervisors from both the School of History as well as the School of Music. So, of course, the subject was related to Indian classical music, a historical era in the annals of Indian music. But then when you do a PhD in history, you need to do a PhD history of something. You have to do the history of architecture, history of environment, history of people, history of music. So this inferiorizing of disciplines, saying the history of music is somehow inferior to, say, political history or economic history, that just doesn't cut eyes. At a PhD level, these things don't matter. So, so that is one part of it. So who is a historian, as you rightly said? Is it only someone who works in a university? What about others who are pursuing it as their profession, as their passion outside the system? So this gatekeeping that keeps happening. And these are the same people who talk of elitism and Brahminism and all of that. If Brahminism is the euphemism for elitist gatekeeping, these are the same people who keep asking Ekalavya for his thumb. Ekalavya, who came from outside the system of Drona's cozy club, had to prove his worth every time, saying you don't belong to this cozy club of the Pandavas, and so you need to prove yourself, as to what your credentials are. So this thing keeps happening. So lots of dichotomy there, and those are there for anybody with a sane mind to see and assess themselves. The next level of the next wave of attacks that have come, and this cancel culture, is now to attack the work, and very, very specious and unsubstantiated, allegations that these are based on Savarkar's own self-narratives, and all kinds of things which have been doing the rounds, and selective quoting from text. Now, who determines what is selective? That's a very objective thing to say. And self-narratives in a biography the first reliance is on a lot of self-narratives.
Of course, I mean, that should be a primary source.
Primary source is what the person thinks and says himself. But I was quite surprised to see somebody on social media had actually, to counter that particular allegation, the person had gone, chapter by chapter and said there were X number of sources in the end notes that were there, what percentage of it was actually based on Savarkar Samagra or some of his own writings. And the numbers were anything between 10 to 20% at the max. And a lot of personal stories about a person. How can I triangulate that? How can anybody triangulate? I'll just give one example. So the oft repeated allegation, if I can call that, is in that whole chapter on Savarkar's terrible time at Kalapani. It says, it draws from his source. Now, we must remember that in Kalapani, the kind of tortures that the British gave, they ensured that there were no accounts and records kept of their crime.
There was full censorship, I'm sure.
Censorship, yes. The mainland India and British India did not even know what was happening in Kalapani. So many of the revolutionaries had to smuggle out newspaper articles to ensure that India got to know what was going on in the backyard. And so obviously there were and whatever records were there, they were destroyed when cellular jail closed down. Only a small amount of them went to the National Archives of India. And most of the revolutionaries who were holed up there, they were young men who were from Bengal, Maharashtra, Punjab, who were probably, illiterate. They didn't know how to read and write. They were in their late teens, early 20s. So most of them did not even keep their own records, let alone, when you don't even know how to read and write. So among the people, there were only 3 or 4 individuals who maintained their memoirs. One was, of course, Savarkar. There was Barin Ghosh, the brother of Aurobindo Ghosh. Cellular jail, where there is a paucity of records. At that time too, what I have tried to do is triangulate with the other 2 versions. So every time I talk about Savarkar's problems, he says, the toilet facilities are not available or good food is not available. I have also cross-verified with what Barin says, what Ulaskar says. Does this actually, triangulate with what their, versions are? So I think beyond that, in a restricted, so this also raises philosophical questions as to what exactly are sources. What exactly do you think are important in drawing the life of a person? I'm told even legal records, police records are not to be considered as God-given. You're not supposed to use the person's self-narratives. You're not supposed to use police records, which exonerated Savarkar in the Gandhi murder trial, in which case, what are sources? So I think these are larger questions which have been raised in this debate, which go beyond me or even my work. And I think that is the unintended consequence of all the drama that's been happening in the last couple of months, as you mentioned.
Right, and I mean, as I said earlier, I think this has been a big distraction for you, and hope you are able to move on from this. And again, this question of who's a historian. I mean, just because you're an engineer or a doctor to start with, doesn't mean that you can't in a later phase of your life become a scholarly historian. We have a good common friend, Dr. Uday Kulkarni, who at a much later age, after retiring from Navy and medical practice, became a great historian. So there are plenty of these examples. And specifically about Savarkar, as you mentioned, I mean, he's one person who's one of the most prolific writers himself. So if he has generated thousands of pages of records himself, I think it definitely needs to be considered. And as you said, it's just 10-20% of the sources that are there, given all the other things that you have looked at. Now let's get to the book as well as your research on Savarkar. I know you have been talking about this in interviews for the last 3-4 months. So pretty much every question I could think of has already been asked multiple times. So I thought a little bit in terms of, I and Roshan, in terms of what are some of the questions that haven't been discussed, at least at length. So we will try to focus on some of them, hopefully. So one question that comes to mind is, in the early 1920s, where the transition between the 2 volumes in your book, one person who Savarkar didn't get a chance to meet after he came back from Kalapani was Lokmanya Tilak. And Lokmanya Tilak was clearly his idol, as can be seen from some of his speeches and writings later on. And of course, he was influenced. A young Savarkar at Ferguson College was influenced by Tilak. In some respects, I've heard some people say that he was, in some sense, a partial ideological successor to Lokmanya Tilak, because after 1920, Tilak didn't really have a political successor of sorts. But they had differences in many views as well. So how do you think the influence that Lokmanya Tilak had on Savarkar specifically, and to what extent did he continue his legacy versus their paths diverged? I think this would be an interesting topic to talk about.
Indeed, and something that we've never, I think, touched earlier. As you rightly said, I mean, right from his childhood, the influence of two men, one was, of course, Lokmanya Tilak, and the other was someone who shares your surname, S.M. Paranjpe of the Karl newspaper, who was...
Shivaram Madhav Paranjpe.
Yes. So both of them were people who, not only Savarkar, but a lot of young revolutionaries in Maharashtra really idolized and looked up to. And Tilak, at least at times, the Kesari and the Maratha, they were, adopting slightly safer positions when it came to, say, the Chafikar brothers and other issues, where they did not want to openly associate with the revolutionaries, though underground, Tilak was actually providing all the material support, including financial support to many of the revolutionaries. But Karl newspaper was a more forthright one, which was unabashed in its, propounding of the armed revolution method of gaining freedom. I think so. This entire thing from Pune, considering you're from there, and while he was a student in Ferguson College, it was at the behest and leadership of Tilak that Savarkar organized the first bonfire at the Lakadi Kapul place there, where, you think of bonfire and the image comes of Gandhiji and the Swadeshi movement, but it was Savarkar who organized the first ever boycott of foreign goods and clothes, which was done in a large scale in Pune, for which he paid a very heavy price. He was rusticated from college. He was fined and all of that. And later it was Tilak who, recommended his name for the Shivaji scholarship too, which Shyamji Krishna Verma was providing in London. So to a large extent, Savarkar could be termed as Tilak's protege. But in those early years of the 20th century, while Tilak was advocating for responsive non-cooperation, where depending on how the government reacts to the various proposals of the Indian side, you would decide to respond, either cooperate or non-cooperate. The revolutionary group led by Savarkar at that time, and this is the pre-Morley Minto reform era, where the government was seen as a despotic force and not as a conciliatory arm at all. Savarkar and others were looking for complete liberation. Right from 1905 with the partition of Bengal at that time. Then you had Madam Bhikaji Kama unfurling the flag of Free India in the international Stuttgart conference, socialist conference at Stuttgart. All of these showed that there was a divergence. Though Tilak was an ideological kind of a fountainhead, he was more in the hurly-burly of politics. And so he had to temper down his responses to a large extent, whereas the revolutionaries, since they were not actually in the field and in direct contact with the government of the day, they could afford to be a little more brazen, which they were. And I think that was the main difference between the two. And unfortunately, as you said, by the time Savarkar came out of jail in 1924, Tilak had already died, and the Congress leadership by then had passed on completely into the hold of Mahatma Gandhi, who had come from South Africa. So the two men who could have, collaboratively put on a big front for Indian liberation, that chance never came. And a lot of the older, generation, whether it was Annie Besant and Lala Lajpat Rai, and all of them in the 20s, the Lal Bal Pal trio, right. All of them passed on in the 20s. So then the mantle then passed on to the new generation. But I see both of them as ideologues, as thinkers. If Tilak also went into metaphysics on some side with Gita Rahasya and all of that he wrote, Savarkar strayed away from anything to do with philosophy and theology and religion and so on. He was an ideologue looking more at practical politics, and particularly in the wake of the Hindu-Muslim problem, the rising Muslim separatism and all of those issues, and came up with his Hindutva doctrine as an intellectual counter to that. So I do see him as an ideological successor of Tilak, but he branched out in the manner in which he would respond to the problems that the British government posed at that time.
Right. So you made an interesting point that, there was really no overlap after Savarkar came back, and that in a what if sort of type of a discussion on Indian history, I think that was obviously a critical issue, because if you look at the other side, the Gopal Krishna Gokhale to Mahatma Gandhi transition happened very effectively, even though Gokhale died in 1915. Whereas there was no real transition from Lal Bal Pal to the next. And in some sense, we probably had to wait for another 15-20 years for the next generation of this side of ideology to come up. But we'll have that as a separate discussion sometime. Roshan, why don't you get in with some of your questions?
Sure. No, it's fascinating listening to the both of you. Vikram, you've earlier said that, history is the handmaiden of the ruler, right? But is there such a thing as objective history? Is there a version of history that you can privilege over some other versions? Or do you think that we should exist with multiple points of view and people have to read maybe 3 or 4 different sources to come to their own conclusions? What do you think?
Yes. So I normally, when it comes to any narrative of history, I talk about this, this poem that we all read, I think, as children, The Blind Man and the Elephant. So where every blind man touches one particular part of the elephant and says the elephant looks like the trunk, the elephant looks like the tusk, someone says the elephant is like a slimy tail, and someone says the elephant is broad like the body that the blind man touches. So they're all correct in their assessment, but they're all only partially correct, because the elephant is the sum total of the parts, and it is not just the trunk or the tail or the tusk or anything else. So the analogy that I somehow feel very inclined to draw between this and the way we look at history is also very similar. You can be objective, but I would say the history as a subject, it is highly mediated, and there are couple of interventions that come. Firstly, at a very philosophical level, the past, by its very virtue not being present, lends itself to a lot of handicap. Unlike physical sciences, you cannot in a chemistry lab see things as they are happening. So this whole obsession with scientific assessment of history, I don't know how much of that can really be done, because it is not a physical science in that way. The second part is all the sources that one has, whether it is epigraphical sources or archival sources, textual documents, inscriptions, whatever. They all come compromised. They all come mediated. They're all incomplete in that sense, only because either they've been destroyed or they come in with their own biases. So are you referring to the source of a court historian during some king's rule, in which case it would be a biased source in itself? So first of all, the nature of the discipline being relating to the past, which cannot be observed in the present, the sources coming with their inherent sense of incompleteness, with their inherent sense of biases. That is the second handicap. And the third handicap is the biases and the lack of capability or expertise of the person who's accessing the sources, the modern historian, who comes in with his or her own set of biases and lack of knowledge or anything, a plethora. So in all these cases, you can see the kind of highly mediated, the kind of highly, it's literally like a reconstruction of a jigsaw puzzle, which is what one is trying to do. So this whole sanctimoniousness that my version is the true version and it is the absolute truth and there is no other version, I think that goes against the very grain of the discipline. Accept the fact that there will be multiple versions, there will be contestations, there will be different narratives which are there and which needs to be nurtured and allowed to thrive, and which is exactly what sadly has not happened in India, particularly after independence, where the stranglehold of the Marxist, a very, very dominant ideology of the Marxist historiography has ensured that all other sources, all other schools of thought are suppressed, and it is one dominant view which gains ground, which goes to the detriment of the discipline itself. Because as I said, fundamentally, where there is a need for the thriving of multiple versions of discussion, debate, dissent, differences of opinion, if you shut down all voices of dissent and have only a megaphone of an echo chamber, then I don't think much can be achieved. And that is exactly what has happened with Indian historiography, particularly after independence.
Right. And so it makes history subject to a lot of distortions as well, and it can be used politically as well, right? So is there a level of technicality that we can introduce in history? I don't know, maybe weighing things in the archaeological sciences or, various kind of documentations. Has something like that progressed on that front? Or
when you say technicalities, what do you mean?
No, I mean, can we look at history in a little more technical way, in a more like how we look at science? Perhaps I know you mentioned that we can't look at it as pure chemistry, but perhaps dating certain things. I mean, perhaps looking at archaeological sources and so on. Because again, if you look at Indian history, it's famously bereft of any archaeological stuff, right? So I was just wondering if there's a layer of the technicality that you can include that you can introduce in history to have more of a weighted truth of what really happened.
Yeah, it is probably a little difficult because history deals with, it's finally, whether all the humanities, they deal with human beings and human minds and how they responded to different circumstances and situations. So that human beings are unreasonable and unpredictable. So whether it is in the present or in the future, where you can't actually empirically state how you or I also would respond to a particular situation. It's very, very subjective. It's very on the spur of the moment. So in such a case, what people did in the past, especially when it is not, as some famous historian had said, not stored in amber and immutable through the ages, and every generation looks back and drawing from their own experience seeks to illuminate the past. In such a case, archaeology is just one tool which establishes some of the hard facts. It's a very important tool, but it's not the complete toolkit or tool set required to reconstruct the past. You need to verify it, triangulate it with several other sources which come with their inherent bias. And as I said, even archaeology, it is incomplete. If places have been destroyed, if the sources itself have been destroyed, or it has been inadequately unearthed, then your inferences are also incomplete or sometimes erroneous. So now we had that Sanoli excavation, which after several years, we have this whole, theory that horses and chariots, etc., were something indigenous to India, and this kind of, and the genetic, analysis that was done on Rakhi and the whole Aryan invasion theory, which was a dominant theme even a few decades ago. So to that extent, some of these theories which are long lasting, which have been positioned into the mind of people, that perhaps can be changed with archaeology. But a lot of other things, which suppose a work on Savarkar, for example. So where would archaeology come to my aid if I'm looking back at Savarkar's life? So that's why it's a combination of sources, and all these sources, including archaeological sources, are highly mediated, highly incomplete, and can lead to erroneous conclusions. So it's very, very difficult to get to physical sciences kind of a weighted average of the truth when it comes to drawing conclusions with history. And that is the intellectual beauty of the discipline. Now, if everything about the past is already known and cast in stone, and then all historians would go out of job. All you have to do is just learn that by rote and create a bunch of parrots in universities who will then ferret out the same details. The very fact that there is need for new discovery, there is need for new sources to look into. I may have written a well-researched biography of Savarkar, but tomorrow somebody who comes up with new sources, someone who comes up with new evidences, which I either willfully suppressed or I did not come across in my research due to my own inadequacies, that new research can completely displace my work, however well-researched, well-written, commercially well-received book that I may have written. And so that is the challenge, that is the intellectual challenge that the discipline poses, and which gives that the subjectivity is actually its strength and not its weakness, in my view.
Yeah, it certainly makes it more interesting, I would say, right? That we have different perspectives. When we look at people of the past, right, and especially great leaders and so on, often these are very complicated people, right? I mean, whoever you take, whether it's Gandhi or Savarkar, or we saw the recent controversy over Bose, right? So how should one look at them, and what is the kind of lens that we should have when we look at these people who are important for our history?
I think making judgments based on yardsticks and circumstances of today, I think that becomes the problem. Like, when you mentioned Bose and the constant criticism worldwide is, oh, he went and joined hands with fascists and all of that. These are terminologies, the Nazis and the anathema that the Nazis are today. It's a very contemporary issue. At that time, at the time when Bose went there and met Hitler and actually got disillusioned with him and moved away, the horrors of the Holocaust, the whatever was happening there was still not yet known. They were a very powerful, seen as an anti-imperialist force. This whole pan-Asianism and the rise of Asia as a bulwark against imperialist Europe, that was a very, very potent idea just before the advent of the Second World War, and it had captured the imagination of several people. So, but then today we actually judge a man by some of these yardsticks and standards and definitions of today. Similarly, even Gandhi's various actions, inactions, flip-flops, whatever, I think the need to humanize them, not to make them into idols who can do no wrong. It was a error of judgment on various counts, or the circumstance led them to take a particular decision. Looking at that with a kind of an iconoclastic sense, and not with a deifying kind of an image of these people, I think that is important. So even Savarkar's oft repeated petitions and all of that, they need to be looked at in context as to how, what were the circumstances in cellular jail, what would he have achieved by rotting in that jail for 50 years, that the punishment was given to him. And then once you humanize that, and not sitting in air-conditioned rooms and having the luxury of retrospective vision, we can either defy or damn anybody of the past according to our biases, our limited understanding. I think understanding people in their context and their situation, that is very important. And most biographies come with the subtitle, The Life and Times of so-and-so, right? But then most biographers don't concentrate on the times. It's almost like just a linear chronology of the life. The times are very important to look at. What were the situations and circumstances in which your protagonist was placed? How did that situation impact the protagonist? And how did your protagonist influence the situation? The osmosis between these two entities. I think looking at that holistically is how I would suggest we look at characters of our past. Nobody is is a holy cow, to use that word, and I think all gods have feet of clay. And so when Arun Shourie wrote his worshipping false gods, and it became such a huge issue on the analysis of B.R. Ambedkar and his life and times, these are important pointers that we need to understand, that today's politics may have appropriated many of these characters as icons. But from a scholarly and academic and from a layman's perspective, we need to humanize them and look at them holistically. Otherwise, we're doing them also, I feel, a lot of injustice.
You really highlighted the key point, and that is context is extremely important, because if you have a political view, then you will take specific context responses or statements or events or facts and position them. But if you're a historian, then you would look at the entire context and, what was the environment, what was the situation, what could someone else have done differently in that, and put all of that together and then present the view. And I think most of the study of history often misses this context. Yeah. And I mean, Netaji, the Netaji discussion over the past few weeks is another latest example in this. But since we're talking about Netaji, one question that I wanted to bring up, again in the context of the book as well, is what was the relation between Netaji and Savarkar? There is that famous photo of both of them sitting together. I think it's from around 1940 or 1940. Mumbai. Yeah. And that photo is often tweeted or quoted. But beyond that photo, what was the level of interaction? How much did Savarkar influence Netaji or vice versa? And how long that connection was active after 1940?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it keeps coming up time and time again, where both sides take very, very exaggerated positions. Either it is shown that Netaji hated Savarkar, or the other side is, they were such brothers in arms. I think the truth is somewhere in between, where, when Savarkar was released completely from Ratnagiri in 1937, and he could participate in politics, Netaji, who was then the president of the Congress, among others, he also gave out a very warm message to Savarkar, and the general hope had been that Savarkar would join the Congress. And that's what even Netaji in his message says, that I hope he joins the national movement and adds strength to the Congress and so on. But then I think a lot of them were very disappointed when he decided not to, and actually took on what was then a very decrepit party, the Hindu Mahasabha, almost like a, tail end of the Congress. They had multiple dual memberships with Congress members, Madan Mohan Malviya and several others who were also Congress members, Munje for some time, all of them. So the fact that Savarkar positioned himself as an opponent, a political opponent who formed for electoral politics. Mind you, by 1937, elections had started after the Government of India Act. So along with the Congress and the Muslim League, which were the main parties, the Hindu Mahasabha had emerged as a third front. So obviously, leaders of political rival parties, whether it is in the Congress or the Muslim League, would have to castigate Mahasabha and Savarkar, and vice versa, because they were all in electoral arena. Today, BJP and TMC and AAP and all of them, they hurl barbs at each other because they are all in the electoral arena. Something very similar here too, where Netaji obviously on party lines, he was very opposed to the Mahasabha, though he had personal regard and reverence for Savarkar. In fact, even after he formed the Forward Bloc, recently, my good friend Chandra Ghosh, who's coming out with a biography of Netaji, he brought out an article of the Forward Bloc. The magazine itself is called Forward Bloc, in which Krishna Iyer and Netaji saw all the articles. I think he was the editor also of the magazine. So he saw all the articles that were going. It couldn't have gone without his consent. So Krishna Iyer writes a very, very eulogizing piece on Savarkar. I think this is in early 1940, where he says he's a prince among revolutionaries, and he's cast in the classical mold of a great revolutionary of his times. Of course, he's deviated into some other sectarian politics, which he should not have. But personal regard for him as a person was extremely high. So that nuance, where as people, they respected each other, but on each other's politics, obviously they had things to, discuss against. So to make memes out of that and circulate on social media today, I think that is, anyway, that's the nature of the beast that social media is. But the other link that was there between Netaji and Savarkar, who was Rash Bihari Bose. And Rash Bihari Bose, right from 1937, the kind of adulatory messages. And in my book, I've quoted all the letter exchanges that have happened between him and Savarkar. Sitting in Japan, he was completely beholden by Savarkar's thought process, ideology, this whole idea of militarized opposition to the British. In fact, in this Dai Ajia Shugi, the Japanese magazine in 39 or something, he writes a very, very eulogizing, biography of Savarkar in that magazine itself, a very beautiful article. He establishes a chapter of the Hindu Mahasabha in Japan and gets all the works of Savarkar translated to Japanese. And later it is he who founded the Azad Hind Fauj, the INA, which later Netaji became the head of. It was not something that Subhash Chandra Bose had already formed. So these, and then despite these, political differences, interestingly, in 1940, Netaji was willing to form an alliance with the Hindu Mahasabha in Calcutta for the corporation elections, for which the Congress castigated him so much. So memes can be made of that also, of the kind of things that the Congress said of him: 9-day wonder, sharing the bed with the fascist, and all kinds of things like this. So, Shama Prasad Mukherjee, the other Bengal Mahasabha leaders, were actively in talks with Netaji to form this alliance. In the last minute, for whatever reasons, egos or whatever, seat sharing problems or whatever, that alliance fell apart. And lo and behold, Netaji forms an alliance with the Muslim League and fights that elections. So on the one hand, he's also giving these statements about communalism and castigates both Jinnah and Savarkar as being two sides of the coin, but he's also willing to do business with both of them in the electoral arena. And that is so relatable in today's politics, where Shiv Sena and the Congress
were... It's complex. It's complex. You can't have a binary view on some of these things.
So who would have believed in their right mind even 5 years ago that the Shiv Sena and the Congress and NCP would get together and form a government? But it happens. Politics is the art of the impossible. And so these people were all, at the end of the day, politicians who were also dealing with that era. We make them gods and we say they were stuck in binaries, which they were not. And I think that is important to see. This whole thing that they met in, I think, June 1940 at Savarkar's house in Dadar. And while Netaji has no, reference to what happened in the meeting, etc., Balarao Savarkar, who was Savarkar's secretary, later wrote that in that meeting, Netaji had actually come to canvass support for his forward bloc and the civil disobedience movement that they were wanting to start. But Savarkar said there is no point, doing the civil disobedience. You are doing this time and time again. So why don't you leave the country? Enemy's enemy is a friend. So ally with them, and made those connections apparently with Rash Bihari Bose. There was also this case of this lady, Savitri Devi, whom I mentioned in my book, who acted as a conduit between the Nazi forces and Netaji. She was very actively associated with Baba Rao as well as Vinayak Savarkar. Right. And so all these cross connections through which it is inferred that just 6 months later, Netaji left India. But of course, a lot of other things are also there. There is that whole radio address, etc., which, initially I had also thought that this was Netaji's own address in 1945, I think, which 1943 or something, which he gives there, but it is nowhere to be found in the collected speeches of Netaji, and it's only makes its appearance in Dhananjay Keel's book, where he quotes the India Independence League publication. But we don't have any source material for that. And also the way he addresses Savarkar there as Veer Savarkar. Netaji always called him Mr. Savarkar. So these things led me to a suspicion that as long as there are no sources, you cannot believe that he was actually praising him or whatever, even after going to Japan. But the fact remains that a lot of the soldiers that Savarkar was mobilizing for the British Indian Army, they were the ones who provided the feeder circuit to Netaji's INA. In the INA trials, many of these people came forward and said, we joined the army on the behest of Barrister Savarkar. We got trained in warfare and then switched over to the INA side. So to that extent, I'm sure Savarkar's efforts eventually helped the INA. Efforts of militarization actually helped the INA in the long run.
Yeah, I think a very complex topic. And talking about Savarkar and some of these, I would say, geopolitics issues as well, especially going beyond the boundary of India pre-1947. And after 1947, also, he wrote and talked extensively about the geopolitics situation around India, especially with regards to Pakistan, China, and other countries as well. And I think that's an important aspect of Savarkar that's not very well discussed, especially, I mean, a lot of these views were there before 1947, but after 1947, the new independent India, he had very clear and strong views on foreign policy and on defense policy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
And those are especially relevant now, again, with what's going on with China, especially in the last two years.
So I think even before independence, his constant thing, including as president of the Hindu Mahasabha, in his speeches, the idea was like what we now know, that in foreign policy there are no permanent friends or enemies, but only permanent national interests. That was something that he stressed all the time, where don't be fascinated with all these isms. So fascism and Nazism and Bolshevism and all these things. Whatever works for you and for your country, nation first. I think that was a very, very important tenet of his policy with any other nation. Whichever country comes to your support or is kind to you or helps you in your national goal, that country is your friend. He did not very curiously see the moral underpinnings of these associations. So if Hitler was what he was, if he was helping India in her struggle for freedom, he is to be befriended, because according to him, Churchill was maybe leading a democratic government.
It was a bigger enemy at that time.
Yeah, a bigger enemy. And how much better is Churchill the head of a democratic government, or Stalin, who's the head of the Soviet Union? Are they any better for India than Hitler? So look at what India has to gain from any association and do it accordingly. And this is what I think, colored all his views, whether it is including his support for Israel. Well, most of other Indian leaders, including India as a country, did not recognize or be very supportive of Israel. Savarkar at that time itself had said in 1948 that he supported the creation of the homeland for the Jews, and that this is, and we have a lot of common, features, which is now coming true. The kind of Indo-Israel collaboration on anti-terrorism, on agriculture, on startups, technology, all of that. So that also is a very important factor. On Pakistan, the constant idea, even among congressmen, and I've mentioned that in the closing chapters of the second volume, that several of the old school congressmen also believed very firmly that partition was just a temporary exercise, that at some point Pakistan would collapse under the improbability of its existence, particularly economically and financially, and splinter into groups and merge back into Bharat. And so this whole idea of Akhand Bharat and getting back to what it was agreed upon, because it was thought of as a temporary measure, that they would see the stupidity of the whole exercise, and also it would collapse under its own weight and economic burden and come back. And in fact, this was one reason that they propounded so much of Pakistan's dismemberment, that during the Nehru-Liaquat Pact, Nehru actually got the entire Hindu Mahasabha and especially Savarkar behind bars under Preventive Detention Act, because according to that, if you talk ill of a foreign nation, that is somehow being anti-national. And so all these forces, which were actually patriotic, which were seeking a dismemberment of Pakistan, something we talk today about, how do we separate Balochistan and Sindh and all these people and help those movements, if at all there are, that was construed then as being anti-national, because it calls for a dismemberment of a foreign nation, which is our friend, while Nehru and Liaquat Ali were signing the pact. And for that reason, Indians had to be put in jail for doing this treason. So this was on Pakistan. And on China, I've quoted extensively his writings in the Kesari, where time and again he kept cautioning Nehru's government to be cautiously optimistic about China, that it had imperialistic designs, that when it invaded Tibet, India should have, and Tibet being a buffer state, India should have acted in support and so on more proactively. Instead, we were supporting China's cause in the Security Council. We were having this Panchsheel and Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, etc., which he said was a great thing, but it is good to be cautiously optimistic because their designs are not to be trusted. And as history has proven right from the 1962 war and then onwards, China has been a very, very unreliable neighbor. And so on many of these important fronts of national security, of defense, of foreign policy, I think Savarkar's understanding of geopolitics, given right from his childhood, the amount of precocious reading that he did, made him understand global politics much better than several of his contemporaries. In fact, in the book I write, in 1929, 10 years before the outbreak of the Second World War, in the Shraddhanand that he was editing, he wrote 4 articles talking about the possibility of another global conflict. At that time, there was not even a squeak of a war. But then in the interwar years, he was keeping himself abreast of all the unrest that was going on in Europe and predicted that there would be another big global outbreak, and in which India would be a field of action, or Asia would be a very important component, which again turned out to be true, considering you had Japan and China and everyone in the conflict. And India should not miss the bus this time. And what the kind of benefits that India could have accrued during the First World War and probably freed herself much earlier, she should not squander away those gains. And enemy's enemy is your friend. And when your enemy is in distress, particularly in war, that is the best time to create underground rebellions and disaffection in the army. So these prescriptions he was giving in 1929, 10 years before the Second World War. And this was also the time when people accused him of being a stooge of the British. So here was a man who was actually giving prescriptions for British dismemberment of British India and liberation of the country, which goes on to show a very keen understanding of geopolitics.
Yeah, I think you mentioned, I think this is one facet. I'm glad you highlighted this. Is not talked about a whole lot. His vision of geopolitics and defense was so clear from such an early stage. And the other person that we don't talk about, which we just discussed some time back, is Lokmanya Tilak. I think he also wrote extensively about geopolitics in Kesari and Maratha, going back to 1905 and the Japan-Russia war at that time and the implications to the world. And the reason I brought Tilak again is there's this famous speech by Savarkar in 1956 in Pune, which was the birth centenary of Lokmanya Tilak, and that 1 hour speech is quite amazing. Unfortunately, I'm not able to find it, the entire one. I had it 10 years back, but now only part of it is there. But there he talks extensively about the risks of China and the defense policy needs. He even talks about nuclear weapons and how they are going to be so important in the decades ahead. So I think that there's so much attention he put on these aspects, and those are also not discussed, and we didn't follow through on some of his writings and recommendations in such an important area. That's our loss. I think we're going to have a few more questions. I think we don't have too much time. One question that I want to ask, even though you have talked about it probably a few dozen times already, but it's especially important. Given where I am at, and that's Pune, because after 1948, after Mahatma Gandhi was killed, what happened in Pune and Maharashtra and some parts even outside Maharashtra is something that's been completely buried. And first of all, would like to thank you for bringing up some of this back to limelight. And you have talked about it extensively, but I would still like to hear from you about some of the first-hand interviews that you were able to do and the first-hand feedback you got from people. Many of them, even 70 years later, wanted to stay anonymous. But would still like to hear from you about that, because that's something that Pune definitely suffered a lot at that time.
Right. In fact, Amit, the horrors of that came very close home, because my maternal side, being Maharashtrian, my segment of my mother's family was actually affected. They were in the Desh side of Maharashtra, and many people of the family were killed, though they had nothing to do with politics or something. It was only because of the caste. And so they had to, most of them then migrated to Mysore state, which was the neighboring state of refuge. But then it was, so I remember my mother talking about this, several years ago, about how there was this extended family and there was just one woman survivor and all the other men of the family were actually hacked. And she didn't understand the politics of it or why this happened. So that stayed somewhere in my mind. And so while I was doing this, it was also necessary. And many of the Marathi books, novels and so on did mention that, not the so much of the actual details. So then I put out this post on social media saying, would people like to come out with facts from their family histories, oral histories? Because finally, when documentation fails you, I think oral history, you're talking of sources. So oral history then becomes an important source. Documents fail in this case because FIRs were not filed, cases were not registered. It was almost made to be felt that such a event never happened in the history of India. And so other than Maureen Patterson, the foreign scholar who did yeoman work on it, and then Conrad Elst wrote about it, it's not even been mentioned or written in modern Indian historiography. So when I put out this post, there were lots and lots. I was inundated with very, very sad stories of how entire villages were ethnically cleansed of Maharashtrian Brahmins, of how starting from Bombay, Pune, and Nagpur and so on, later spread to Satara, the Patwardhan princely states, Miraj and Sangli, and all the Kolhapur and all these places, where even Balji Pendarkar and his studio was gutted. So many such, and of course the Kolhapur, the Maharaja had constituted the Kowaji Commission to probe into the riots and the genocide, and that was a 100-page report, which also was an important source. But these oral histories were very interesting. A couple of senior members who, unfortunately, by the time the book came out, actually passed on. But I had the good fortune of actually interviewing them, who were eyewitnesses. They were either 15 years or 16, 17 years old when this happened, and they had seen it up close, how their own houses were burned down, how indiscriminately, for them not even being associated with politics, how members of their family were killed. People were literally, first what started as anyone whose surname was Godse was being caught and put on fire. Later on, the calumny extended to all Chitpavan Brahmins, and then all Maharashtrian Brahmins, whether it was Deshasthas or anyone. So that chapter of Indian history, I think, never got its due. Like the Kashmiri Pandit exodus, I think this ethnic cleansing also needed to be told. But what really pained me was that many of these people, shared their stories to me. But then when I had to take permission, it is ethics to actually take their permission to put it in print. Many of them, prefer to be anonymous. So the appendix to the book comes with a lot of these testimonies, all clubbed under anonymous, barring 2 or 3 bravehearts who came out with their names. Many of them wanted to remain anonymous only because they said people who led the riots, or who instigated them, their successors or the same parties are in positions of power in Maharashtra today. So imagine the kind of fear that even after 70 years, people can't even talk about it. Justice is a far cry. At least talking about it and making peace with that, even that courtesy is not allowed to a victim of a casteist pogrom, which says a lot about our country. And I think hopefully through this, there will be more people who will dig into it. I don't know how many people who are eyewitnesses of it are still around. I hope we can kind of consolidate some of these views and bring out the angst. Justice cannot be achieved now. It's not even, people have moved on in life, they've rebuilt their lives and so on. So justice cannot be got that way, but at least narrating your stories and letting the world know that what happened. I think that is very important. And history provides that space for healing, provides those spaces where these sad episodes can be recounted and made peace with.
And I think, as I said, thanks a lot for even highlighting this issue and the detailed testimonies that you got from so many anonymous sources. We have a lot more questions, but I think we are running out of time. So, Roshan, maybe you can take one or two of the last questions, and then if we have more time, I have many more questions, but we'll let Vikram make the call after this.
Yeah, no, it's again, I mean, it's been fascinating listening to the both of you. I think, so much of nuance that you're bringing out on every subject, right? It's pretty amazing. So Vikram, I mean, one of the, often repeated demands of, the supporters of the government is to revise or rewrite the history and many different facets of it, at least, right? So if I were to ask you, how should one embark on this project of doing that, right? Revising the history, correcting a little bit of that narrative and so on. Would you have any opinion on that as to how we should go about it?
Yeah, so I think the supporters of the government, as you rightly said, often, berate it that not enough has been done in the last 8 years that they've been in power to kind of relook at particularly the textbooks of history. I think when we talk of history, it's too widespread. One is the large, the popular scholarship and the academic scholarship, and but what matters the most are the textbooks eventually, because a lot of young Indians, their only brush with their past begins and ends with school, because many of them don't probably take up history in their future. They branch out into other disciplines, and history is just an elective in college or whatever, if at all. They even do economics or whatever. So the school years are very important, where a narrative of the past is presented in a manner that it's a story of your country. It's not you're reading the story of some other country, which is how I think most of our textbooks are. The story of defeats, the story of wars we lost. That's how a sense of inferiority and feeling very apologetic about your past, your culture, that is what is highlighted in our books, textbooks particularly. And so, and incommensurate, attention and space given to only few dynasties, particularly those in and around Delhi, large parts of India, whether it is southern India, northeast India, the Marathas, all of them don't get the attention and importance that they truly deserve. So a lot of these imbalances are there in the way our books are written. I mean, the NCERT website has all the class 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, the history books online. So all your viewers can actually go and for free download those books and see. The Chola Empire probably has a few lines. The Vijayanagar Empire is not even mentioned in detail. It's half a paragraph or something. Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj is not even mentioned in a class 7 book. Only thing is a photograph of his. He occupies 25% of a page where there's only a photograph of his, and the caption is all that a young boy or girl in India reads about Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj and the Peshwas, and the fact that the history of 18th century India is the history of Marathas, and the fact that the British took over India not from the Mughals but the Marathas. Do we give them and their kingdom the importance? So people know that these are all the flaws. They've been spoken ad infinitum. But I think on the one hand, there is the need for the government to wake up and for people to, and governments wake up only when there is a pressure group. There are lobbies of civil society. We do not think it's so important to have petitions or to have representations made to the government saying that, thus far and no further. And we really need a relook at it. And when a relook doesn't mean a hodgepodge job or some loony sitting and creating fake, mythology as history, but actual scholars and, true histories which need to be represented in the right way. But I think outside the realm of government, a lot of civil society, there is a need to look at historiography as a very important task of civilizational conversation, a civilizational debate, nation building, and so on. And since that's not happened, so in fact, I'm very happy to share that very recently we've just started, along with two foundations, one in India and one in the US, the Motwani Jadeja Foundation in the US and the Indic Academy in India. We've decided to launch a fellowship, a scholarship, which is given to scholars to write a full-fledged manuscript. The fellowship runs for a year, and at the end of the year, they come out with a manuscript which gets published. And these would be popular history books, which relooks at our past in a very modern, source-based, meticulous research, which I hope, and every year if you have 8 to 10 such scholars coming, in 10 years you have 100 new books which come out. That is the only way through which I think the narrative can change. A lot of people focus, I'm not disparaging it, it's important, they focus on the wars on social media, which has its own pluses and minuses. In fact, including this true Indology person I have mentioned, to him, her, whatever, that, why don't you, if you have so much knowledge, please put all this together in the form of a book. It's very, very important, because the legacy of a book is long lasting. It will go beyond the life of the author. And so tweets today, what you tweet tomorrow is forgotten. So there is, while it is important, that also has its importance where you need to counter at multiple levels. Ultimately, the thrust should be on producing new scholarship, which I think the Indic side has sadly not done so much. There's no point going on, berating, oh, the leftists have taken over, and having all these voodoo dolls against Romila Thapar and Irfan Habib. I mean, they did what they did, and it's over. That's history. But what is your contribution? What do you do to change that narrative? Amit, mentioned Dr. Uday Kulkarni. I mean, that is being a change agent. If there is no work on the Marathas done, you be the person who does it, and he does it so wonderfully, and his books are so popular. He self-publishes them. He puts all his effort, his money into making this possible. I think there are need for many more such scholars, and hopefully the corporate sector, the NRIs, and a lot of people in India who are so passionate about this, we can crowdfund and make historiography and history writing a very, very important component of our national discourse. History is too important to be left to the academics, particularly the leftist academics who have played so many perverse games with our past.
Absolutely. And I'm very optimistic for that. So Vikram, before we close, would you want to talk about your upcoming projects, your new book, Women of the Records, and so on?
Oh, the Women of the Records has actually already come out.
Oh, it's in March, right? March 2022.
No, it's already.
It's out. Okay.
Out already. My next book is actually coming out in August for the 75th year, and this is precisely to address some of the issues I just mentioned, which was it looks at 15 unsung heroes and heroines from across India and across time spans. And what does it address? It addresses multiple issues, according to me. One is it looks at India holistically, where I'm looking at all those neglected parts of India, including the Northeast and South India, the Marathas, Kashmir, and all of that. And also that the history of India is not a litany of wars that we lost. We put in a lot of resistance. The very fact that we are around today as a civilization shows that there must have been some wars we won also. So who are these heroes and heroines who were a part of this? And thirdly, the role of women in all of this. So that is also sidelined. History becomes his story, which doesn't take her story into consideration most often. So this book brings out these 15 what I thought were very, very fascinating characters, right from Lalitaditya of Kashmir to Naiki Devi in Gujarat, Kanhoji Angre from Maharashtra, Rani Abbakka in Karnataka, who defeated the Portuguese, Marthand Verma from Kerala, who defeated the Dutch East India Company, Velu Nachiyar, who led the first woman who led the war against the East India Company, Lachit Borphukan from Assam, Rajyashree Bhagyachandra from Manipur, Rajendra Chola, Banda Singh Bahadur from Punjab. So many of these names, which will probably not even strike a bell in today's people, particularly the youth. So this book is more a compilation of 15 such short stories and biographies. And in this Amrit Mahotsav and all that, when we are celebrating, I think this should become a precursor to many more such books which can be written, because I'm sure people will ask, why these 15? Why was that one left? Why was this state left? Why was that one not picked up? So I think the precursor to many more similar themed unsung heroes and heroines from different parts of India, different eras, which is how I think the past can be illuminated, and we can look back at our past with a sense of more coherence and pride.
Right, that's a great note to end the podcast on. Thank you again, Vikram, for being on the podcast. Truly appreciate it. This was a fascinating conversation. Amit, any final words from you?
Thank you so much to Amit and you. And Amit has always been, I think this podcast has ensured that none of the questions have been repeated from what we've spoken ad infinitum. So the credit goes entirely to you and Amit for that. And thank you so much for having me.
I'll just say once again, thanks, a big thanks to Vikram. I've been a big fan of his work for a long time now, and the amount of scholarship and detailed work that he has brought to this discipline and on the specific figures like Savarkar that he's covering is just amazing, and it will go a long way in addressing multiple gaps, both in terms of biographies of these people as well as the overall discussion about what history should be and how it should be written that Roshan, you also asked about.
Yeah.
I just would like to wish Vikram all the best in his upcoming books. I've also suggested to him about some other biographies that he should be writing, but of course, I mean, he has finite time, even though he is superhuman in terms of output capacity. So all the best, and always looking forward to your next big work. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vikram. Thank you so much. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Bharatvaarta podcast. If you want to see more content like this, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We started Bharatvaarta to facilitate long-form discussions on politics, policy, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. If you wish to offer us feedback, do reach out to us on social media. We are at Bharatvaarta on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You could also get in touch with us on our website, www.bharatvaarta.in. The links are in the description below. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.